It was the 3rd of October, 1909. Autumn had settled over Independence, Missouri, that small but prosperous city that lay a short distance east of Kansas City, and the air carried the particular chill of a season turning. The great elms along Pleasant Street had begun to shed their leaves, and the morning light fell in thin, pale sheets across the turreted red brick mansion that housed one of the most prominent families in the state. Within those walls lived the widow Margaret Swope and her 7 grown children, together with her elderly brother-in-law, the celebrated Colonel Thomas Swope, a man whose name had been given to the vast public park he had donated to the city some 13 years prior. He commuted daily by streetcar to his office in the New England Life Building in Kansas City, a frugal bachelor of considerable wealth, known for his quietness and his deep preoccupation, in his final weeks, with the proper distribution of his considerable fortune. On this particular morning, a doctor was in attendance. His name was Bennett Clark Hyde, and he had married into the Swope family 4 years previously. He was 37 years of age, charming, well-connected, and widely admired in the Kansas City medical community. By evening, the colonel would be dead, and the capsule that the doctor had given him would become the most scrutinized object in the history of Missouri's criminal courts. Thomas Swope was born on the 21st of October, 1827, in Lincoln County, Kentucky. He was, by all accounts, a bookish and introspective child, quiet in his habits and careful in his ambitions. After completing his studies at Center College in Danville, Kentucky, in 1848, he attended Yale Law School, though he never entered legal practice. Instead, the young Swope turned his attention toward real estate and mining ventures in New York and St. Louis, developing in those years an instinct for land values and a patience for long investment that would define the remainder of his working life. He arrived in Kansas City in 1857, when the Missouri frontier was still in its formative years. He began purchasing suburban land at prices that others considered unremarkable, and he held that land with extraordinary discipline as the city grew around it. In time, Thomas Swope became the largest individual landowner in Kansas City, a man of $3.5 million, riding the streetcar to his office each morning as though he were a simple clerk. He was known as Colonel, though the title carried no military distinction. It was an honorific, a mark of the community's affection and respect for a man who, despite his vast wealth, remained deeply private. He never married and had no children of his own. In his later years, following the death of his brother Logan in 1900, he moved into the family mansion at 406 South Pleasant Street in Independence, sharing the household with his sister-in-law, Margaret Swope, and her 7 children. By the autumn of 1909, the colonel was 81 years of age and growing conscious of his mortality. He had begun to give serious thought to the disposal of his estate. His will, as it then stood, provided that 9 of his late brother's children should each receive approximately $200,000, with the exception of Frances, the eldest niece, who had married Dr. Hyde, who was to receive $135,000. A residuary fund of $1,405,595 was also to be divided among the nieces and nephews. However, the colonel had grown increasingly inclined to redirect much of this residuary fund toward charitable causes, a decision that would have diminished the inheritance of every beneficiary in the family. In September of 1909, the colonel suffered a minor fall. Although the injury was not serious, it prompted him to reduce his movements and spend more time at home. His nephew-in-law, Dr. Hyde, began visiting more regularly, attending to the old man's health and sitting with him in the parlour of an afternoon. There was nothing to outward appearances to occasion alarm, yet before many weeks had passed, the household would be transformed beyond recognition. Dr. Bennett Clark Hyde was born in 1872 in Cooper County, Missouri, the son of a Baptist minister. He grew up in Lexington, some 40 miles east of Kansas City, and received a thorough education before enrolling at the University Medical College in Kansas City, from which he graduated with distinction. He was, by the testimony of those who knew him, a man of considerable personal magnetism, possessed of a fine singing voice, and said to be able to recite the soliloquies of Shakespeare from memory. One former patient would recall that his voice was so persuasive that it made her feel she was doing him a favour by consenting to treatment. Yet from the very beginning of his professional career, his record was not without shadow. During his tenure as demonstrator of anatomy at his alma mater in 1898 and 1899, 2 men were arrested for robbing graves at St. Mary's Cemetery in Independence. Both made statements implicating Dr. Hyde as the party who had directed them. Charges were duly filed, but were eventually dropped in March of 1899 for want of sufficient evidence to proceed. In May of 1905, Dr. Hyde was appointed Kansas City police surgeon, a position of considerable standing. 1 month later, on the 21st of June 1905, he and Frances Swope were married, clandestinely in Fayetteville, Arkansas. The match was deeply unpopular with Frances's mother, Margaret Swope, who was said to have harboured a settled conviction that the doctor had pursued her daughter with an eye upon future inheritance. In 1907, Dr. Hyde was dismissed from his position as police surgeon on grounds of alleged improper conduct toward a patient. By the autumn of 1909, Dr. Hyde had received from the colonel a generous gift, the house at 3516 Forest Avenue, Kansas City, which Thomas Swope had purchased for $7,500 and presented to his niece and her husband. A reconciliation of sorts had been achieved within the family. Hyde was aware, from conversations with the colonel himself, that the old man intended to consult his cousin, James Moss Hunton, regarding the revision of his will, a revision that threatened to reduce materially what Frances, and through her Dr. Hyde, might ultimately receive. On the evening of the 1st of October 1909, James Moss Hunton, the colonel's cousin and one of the executors of his estate, collapsed suddenly at dinner. Dr. Hyde was summoned. He arrived alongside the family physician, Dr. G. W. Twyman. Both men agreed that the patient had suffered apoplexy. Dr. Hyde elected to draw blood, a treatment Dr. Twyman considered appropriate only to a limited degree. When Dr. Twyman instructed him to cease, having drawn what he deemed a sufficient quantity, Dr. Hyde continued. Nurse Pearl Keller, who was present throughout, observed the exchange. James Moss Hunton died shortly thereafter. The colonel, deeply affected by the loss of his cousin, retired to his bed. 2 days later, on the evening of Sunday, the 3rd of October, 1909, Thomas Hunton Swope, just 18 days from his 82nd birthday, died in his room at the mansion on Pleasant Street. Dr. Hyde was in attendance. He attributed the colonel's death to cerebral hemorrhage. Nurse Keller was not persuaded. The symptoms she had witnessed, she would later attest, were unlike anything she associated with that condition. The colonel's body lay in state at the Kansas City Public Library, where thousands of citizens came to pay their respects. He was a figure of civic renown, and the city mourned him with considerable feeling. A holding vault received his remains, while a tomb was prepared in Swoope Park, as he had wished. For the time being, the family absorbed its grief in relative quietude. Then the household began to fall ill. In December of 1909, 8 of the nieces and nephews of the late colonel, all of them beneficiaries of his will, were struck down with what presented as typhoid fever. On the 6th of December, the eldest nephew, William Chrisman Swope, 31 years of age, died. His symptoms bore a disturbing resemblance to those of his late great-uncle. It was noted by all those present that the symptoms of the afflicted individuals tended to worsen following Dr. Hyde's visits, and to improve markedly in his absence. By this time, 5 nurses were in attendance at the mansion. Their suspicions, shared in whispered consultation, coalesced into something more than professional unease. They had observed Dr. Hyde administering injections of strychnine, a substance employed medicinally only as a stimulant and lethal in excessive quantity. They had noted that the doctor and his family, during their visits to the household, drank only bottled water, while the family fell ill around them. Led by Nurse Keller, the attending nurses delivered an ultimatum to Margaret Swope. Either Dr. Hyde ceased his attendance upon the family, or they would withdraw their services. Hyde was removed from the household. The patients began to recover. Margaret Swope went to the authorities. Her standing in the community was impeccable, and her concerns were received with all the seriousness they merited. Investigators subsequently discovered that Dr. Hyde had received a quantity of typhoid culture from a colleague, Dr. Edward Stewart, in November of 1909, on the representation that it was required for an experiment. A chemist was also located who confirmed that he had supplied Dr. Hyde with substantial quantities of both cyanide and strychnine. On the 15th of February 1910, the grand jury commenced its formal inquiry. On the 12th of January 1910, the body of Colonel Thomas Hunton Swope was exhumed. The examination was conducted under the direction of the distinguished pathologist Professor Ludwig Hechtoen of Rush Medical College in Chicago, who had been brought in at the request of the family's legal representatives. At Professor Hechtoen's direction, Professor Walter Stanley Haynes, also of Rush Medical College, conducted a chemical analysis of the colonel's internal organs. The results were unequivocal. Professor Haynes reported that the body of Thomas Hunton Swope contained lethal quantities of both strychnine and cyanide. The strychnine identified in the liver alone, when calculated across the whole organ, represented approximately 1 grain, a quantity nearly twice what the medical literature of the period considered a fatal dose. More significantly, the brain, which Dr. Hyde had certified as having sustained a cerebral hemorrhage, was found, upon examination, to be entirely free of blood clots or any pathological change consistent with that diagnosis. The body of William Chrisman Swope was also subjected to examination. Professors Hectoen, Haynes, and Victor Vaughan of the University of Michigan were among those who conducted the analysis. They identified strychnine and cyanide in the liver, and while evidence of typhoid infection was present, it was in a form insufficiently advanced to account for death. His death certificate, produced by Dr. Hyde, attributed the cause to cerebral meningitis. The brain was found to be in a healthy condition, with no evidence consistent with that diagnosis. Additionally, Thomas Swope, a nephew of the late colonel, reported having observed Dr. Hyde discard several capsules in the street. He retrieved fragments of those capsules and conveyed them in a sealed envelope to Professor Hectoen in Chicago. Analysis confirmed the presence of cyanide of potassium on the fragments. A nurse, Miss Lou Van Nuys, testified that she had detected the distinctive odour of cyanide on the colonel's hands on the 18th of December, following his handling of capsules provided by Dr. Hyde. When Professor Hectoen was asked before the coroner's inquest what, in his professional opinion, Colonel Swope had died of, he replied that death had resulted from a convulsive and paralysing poison, or combination of poisons. On the 5th of March 1910, a grand jury returned a set of indictments against Dr. Hyde, charging him with the murder of Colonel Swope, the murder of Chrisman Swope, manslaughter in the death of James Moss Hunton, and 7 counts of attempted murder against other members of the Swope household. If you are finding this case as gripping as we are, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps us continue the work of researching and telling these long-forgotten stories from history. We read every comment, and we would love to know your thoughts on this extraordinary case. Now, let us return to the courtroom of Kansas City. Dr. Hyde was arrested and, having been released upon a bond of $100,000, awaited trial. His wife Frances, then in a delicate condition of health, stood entirely by her husband's side. She expressed, publicly and privately, her absolute conviction of his innocence. She engaged 5 defense attorneys, among them the accomplished Frank Walsh, and reportedly mortgaged property in order to meet the considerable expense of mounting his defense. The trial was set to commence in April of 1910. The trial opened before Judge Ralph S. Latshaw in the Criminal Court of Kansas City on the 16th of April 1910. The courtroom was crowded to capacity from the outset. The national press had descended upon Kansas City in force, with correspondents dispatched from as far as New York and Chicago. The Kansas City Journal would later describe the case as rivaling the most dreadful conceptions of French fiction in its diabolical character. The prosecution was represented by District Attorney Virgil Conkling and a team of 4 special prosecutors engaged at the personal expense of Margaret Swope, who was firmly convinced of her son-in-law's guilt. Among the prosecutors was the formidable James A. Reed, a former mayor of Kansas City and one of the most feared courtroom advocates in the state. The defense was led by Frank Walsh and 4 colleagues, including R. Brewster and M. Cleary. Nearly 50 witnesses testified for the prosecution. Professor Hectowen delivered testimony regarding his findings at the exhumation. Professors Haynes and Vaughan offered their chemical analyses. Nurse Pearl Keller testified as to her observations during the final days of the Colonel's life and the death of James Moss Hunton. Young Thomas Swope described the recovery and dispatch of the discarded capsules. A chemist testified that he had sold Dr. Hyde substantial quantities of cyanide. Dr. Edward Stewart confirmed having provided Hyde with a culture of typhoid bacillus. On the 19th of April, the family's trusted physician, Dr. G. W. Twyman, died before his testimony could be recorded, a loss described in the press as a significant blow to the prosecution's case. The defence argued that the Colonel, at the age of 81 and already in decline, had died of a stroke brought on by the grief of losing his cousin. They contended that the strychnine found in the organs was consistent with the tonic preparations the Colonel was known to take medicinally in small doses. They challenged the methodology of the forensic examinations and the competence of the expert witnesses. When Dr. Hyde himself took the stand, he testified that the cyanide he had purchased was intended for the destruction of rats and dogs, a claim that left more than one observer unconvinced. The jury retired to deliberate and did not return quickly. After 3 nights and 2 full days of deliberation, on the 16th of May 1910, the verdict was delivered. Dr. Bennett Clark Hyde was found guilty of the murder of Colonel Thomas Hunton Swope. On the 5th of July, Judge Latshaw sentenced the accused to life imprisonment. Silence settled over the court. Francis Hyde wept. The conviction did not hold. On the 11th of April 1911, the Supreme Court of Missouri overturned the verdict and ordered a new trial, citing procedural errors in the original proceedings. Dr. Hyde's second trial commenced in October of 1911. It endured for several weeks before arriving at a peculiar and widely discussed conclusion. Towards midnight on the 11th of December, a juror named Harry Warden was discovered to have climbed through the window of his hotel room and descended the fire escape. When located by police, he stated that the sight of his wife and children in the courtroom had caused him a state of profound agitation, and that he could endure the proceedings no longer. The second trial was declared a mistrial. Many in Kansas City were skeptical of the explanation. Rumours spread that the flight had been purchased. A third trial followed in January of 1913. The jury could not reach agreement, and the case was again declared a mistrial. A fourth trial was commenced in January of 1917, but it was brought to an abrupt close when Hyde's attorneys correctly argued that, under the laws of the state of Missouri, a defendant could not lawfully be subjected to more than 3 trials on the same criminal charges. Dr. Hyde was a free man. The total cost of his defense was estimated at $250,000, a sum furnished almost entirely by his wife Frances from her share of the Swope estate. The Kansas City Journal, which had covered every development of the case for 7 years, remarked that the people of the city were left to draw their own conclusions from the weight of evidence that had never, in the end, produced a final reckoning. Hyde's professional life was destroyed. He never practiced medicine again in Kansas City. He returned to his hometown of Lexington, Missouri, where for a time he worked as a truck driver and a mechanic, before eventually resuming some degree of medical practice in private. In 1920, Frances Hyde filed for divorce. She had stood by her husband through every trial, spent a fortune in his defense, and endured the hostility of her own family. When her attorney asked her at the time of the proceedings to describe her husband's recent conduct, she replied that he had grown sullen and abusive, had spoken to her in impure and vulgar language, and had encouraged the children to disrespect and deceive her. She gained custody of their 2 children, James Logan Hyde and Frances Hyde, and was at last reconciled with her family. Dr. Bennett Clark Hyde died suddenly on the 7th of August 1934 in Lexington, Missouri. He had walked into the office of a local newspaper to check on election returns, stepped around the counter, and fell to the floor without a word. He was buried in Machpelah Cemetery in Lexington. He never confessed to any crime. His marker no longer stands in the family plot. Thomas Hunton Swope was finally laid to rest on the 8th of April 1918, 8.5 years after his death, on a hill within the park that bore his name, amid a stand of trees overlooking the city he had helped to build. His tomb stands to this day, a Greek temple of white granite, guarded by a pair of stone lions. Below those stones, the colonel lies in the gift he gave to Kansas City, surrounded, in the end, by the public he had quietly served his whole life long.